It's a real honor and a privilege to be here with you tonight. I apologize for last night and very grateful to my very good friend Raymond Moody for filling in so rapidly on short notice. So tonight I'd like to take you on a little journey, something that happened to me 8 years ago. And I think to really get into this, I probably should see a show of hands. I'd like to just raise your hand if you've read the book Proof of Heaven or heard me present before. Okay, so good. So there's quite an audience out there who are not familiar with the story. Well, I want to take you through the kind of personal journey that I've been through of discovery around this. And as you were told in the introduction, I'm a neurosurgeon. I'd spent more than 20 years of my life in neurosurgery. I spent 15 years at Harvard Medical School. And I thought I had a pretty good idea how the brain, mind, and consciousness work. And turns out I was wrong. I was very wrong about it. I was very much fit into the model of modern scientific materialism. And that reductive materialist model, which is the dominant worldview of a lot of our conventional science, basically says that nothing exists but the physical world. And I'm sure there are a lot of people in this audience who have probably known their whole life that that is false. But it is kind of a dominant world paradigm, and certainly a dominant paradigm in our scientific circles. Now, I was very fortunate in my life. I grew up in a home. My father was very influential in my life. He had been a combat surgeon in the Second World War. And his own father had been a general surgeon. He grew up in eastern Tennessee. My father was very religious. His father had taken him to Baptist church every Sunday of his life. My father was also very scientific. He actually, after World War II, came back and was the chairman of a neurosurgical training program. And so I grew up with science and a very deep spiritual version of religion in my main mentor and my father. Now, like many of us who grew up in the 60s and 70s, though, I was a bit challenged. And that is the successes of science and technology in the mid-20th century were very impressive as a dominant worldview. And so that kind of scientific materialism was something that I assumed to be true. And especially, I thought that science, the methodology of science and the scientific approach, is the pathway to all truth. Now, it turns out that I still believe that that is very much the case. But I'm more of a scientist now than I've ever been. And what I also came to realize is that scientific materialism is absolutely wrong. It's a dead end. It's basically strangling itself to death because there is much more to this world than the physical. In fact, I would say the physical is completely subservient to the spiritual. We live in a spiritual universe. We are all eternal spiritual beings. That completely violates everything that I had learned for those many years of my life. Now, my father had taken me to that Methodist church when I was growing up, and I wanted to believe all that. I wanted to believe what I heard in church, that God is very real, that there's power to prayer, that we're spiritual beings, and that when our physical body dies in this world, that potentially we go to heaven or go to hell. That was kind of the dominant paradigm in the very conventional kind of Christian upbringing that I faced. Now, in my many years spent in neurosurgery, though, I had more and more difficulty understanding how the soul could survive, any kind of awareness could survive the death of the brain and body. Now, of course, in the background there is that cornerstone of scientific materialism, which is basically that the brain creates consciousness out of physical matter. And I thought that that was true. And that's basically the underlying supposition of so much of conventional scientific thinking, of that materialist mindset. And therefore, of course, our existence as a being is birth to death and nothing more. And as much as I had wanted to believe those religious teachings, they just did not fit into my worldview and what I saw day in and day out working in neurosurgery. Now, it turns out there were plenty of examples staring me in the face of things that I saw around the time of death, because my focus as a neurosurgeon was in malignant brain tumors. Those are extremely challenging and difficult. And very rapidly you find that you might improve a patient's life and their survival, but sooner or later that disease always seemed to win out. So you become very familiar with death. But doctors in kind of the Western mindset, many of them, I can certainly claim that this is one of my faults. When it comes to a patient who is facing the end of their illness, in some sense we feel that we've failed as a physician. And so we're often not around right when the patient passes over. Now the nurses are. So the nurses get this, and they've gotten it for a long time. I can speak for myself as a doctor. Some of us are a little slow on the uptake. I needed a big thumping, and I got that back in November of 2008, and I'll be describing that in just a minute. But that's basically who I was before all this happened. And then my life shifted dramatically. It shifted at about 4:30 in the morning on November 10th, 2008, when I woke up with severe back pain. Thought maybe if I could make my way down to a hot bathtub down the hall, that the bath would relieve the pain, but no, in fact, it only got worse. I had to use a towel to kind of pull myself up out of the tub, struggled back to bed on tiptoes, collapsing in writhing agony and a cold sweat, just in severe pain. Soon thereafter, my youngest son, his name is Bond. Those who have read Proof of Heaven will realize that that name is far more appropriate than I knew at the time. But Bond came into the room, saw that Dad wasn't off at work yet, and worse yet, seemed to be in extreme agony. So Bond, age 10, came over and started rubbing my temples to make me feel better. As soon as he touched my head, I felt like he'd driven a white hot spike right through my head. Terrific pain, searing pain. Of course, anyone out there in medicine, if you hear about sudden onset of severe back pain, severe headache, you might think meningitis. Well, the doctor was already out. I was going down fast. My brain was being overrun with an extremely primitive, aggressive, and absolutely should have killed me bacterial meningitis. Now, it turns out that that's just about the last memory that I have from this world. And my family thought I was resting, so they just shut the door and let me take a nap to kind of get better. When they checked on me about 2 hours later, they found I was having a grand mal epileptic seizure. And that's when they called 911. And the EMTs came to the house, put in some IVs, gave me some drugs to try and stop the seizures. They couldn't do it. They hauled me off to the Lynchburg General Hospital emergency room. Now, I remember none of this at all. My memories of anything on this world, in this universe, for the next 7 days do not exist. I was long gone from this world. Now, in the book Proof of Heaven, of course, a lot of the story there is what happened on earth while I was gone. Now, all of that, I had to ask family members, friends, doctors, and nurses who took care of me to get that whole story together, of all that kind of backstory. And what I later found out is that when they took me to the emergency room, that I encountered Dr. Laura Potter, ER physician, and she and I were very good friends. I had worked in that emergency room for more than 2 years, and but she didn't even recognize me. All she saw was 54-year-old white male, status epilepticus, unbreakable seizures, in extremis, trying to die right there on her watch. She told me much later that she knew once she did a lumbar puncture, put the needle in my back, and out came the fluid surrounding the brain and spinal cord, and that fluid was thick white pus under pressure. And much later she told me when she saw that, given the fact that I had gone from symptom onset into coma within 3.5 hours, those two facts alone, given that she now knew that I had a bacterial meningitis, gave me about a 10% chance of survival. That was the rosy prognosis on Monday morning when I first got to the hospital. It got a lot worse in the next 7 days. On the second day, they got quite a surprise when microbiology reported back that it was E. coli. Now, spontaneous E. coli meningitis in adults, somewhere less than 1 in 10 million per year. It's extremely rare. In fact, E. coli meningitis almost always occurs in newborns. It's very rare beyond the age of 3 months. So yes, I do have to defend my level of maturity, but that's my problem. And it turns out I'd been put on a ventilator, put on the ICU from day one, put on 3 very powerful intravenous antibiotics, and they basically watched me dwindle. Anyone in medicine knows that a patient who is that sick with bacterial meningitis, especially gram-negative bacterial meningitis, by day 2 or 3, they're either starting to come around and wake up or they're dead. And of course, I was in that mysterious in-between state where I wasn't quite dead, but my doctors knew from my neurologic exams, even when I'd gone into the hospital, that my neocortex, the human part of the brain, the outer surface of the brain, had been wiped out, that there was nothing left functional in my neocortex. And that's the way the week went. And by the end of the week, day 7, my physicians called a family meeting. It was a Sunday morning. And that's when they said, well, basically he's gone from a 10% chance of survival down to a 2% chance. And best case scenario, if he's in that 2% survivor category, is he'll spend a month or 2 in the hospital, then be transferred to a nursing home in a persistent vegetative state, and he'll die there a few months later. He'll never wake up. So that's what my family was facing. So their decision was to stop the antibiotics. Now it turns out that it was a few hours after that I did start coming back to this world. But my doctors were no fools. When I first started to wake up in the ICU, I had absolutely no words, language, no memories of the life of Eben Alexander before coma. In fact, my mother, my sisters, my sons standing at the bedside, I had no idea who these beings were. The only thing I knew was where I had been. And that was on an extraordinary journey that I'm going to describe to you in a few minutes. And it turns out that words and language came back very rapidly over hours and days. Childhood memories over a week or 2. A lot of that was thanks to 2 of my sisters who camped out in little cots at the bedside after I got out of the ICU. And I couldn't sleep night or day. I was very kind of in and out of a psychotic delirium after I came out of coma. And that was a very beautiful gift, that psychotic paranoid nightmare that I went through, because it was very different from what I'd witnessed deep in coma. And then over a few days, I started coming back to a semblance of reality in this world. And by 8 weeks or so, everything I'd known about science, physics, cosmology, everything about neurosurgery, brain, mind, and consciousness, every bit of it was back. In fact, people would ask me, are you back at 90%, 95%? Interesting enough, I was back about 110%. That's a very difficult thing to understand when you realize how badly my neocortex, the human part of the brain, had been devastated in the midst of this illness. Now, the memories that I had when I came back are the real treasure of this. Now, initially when I tried to explain some of this to my physicians, they would pat me on the back and say, well, you were way too sick to have experienced anything. Your brain was soaking in pus. The human part of your brain, your neocortex, was destroyed from day 1. We knew that from the exams, from the scans. We could tell. You can't have had any experience, so you can just forget about it. And I believed them. We believe our doctors, and early on, before any of my knowledge of brain-mind consciousness had returned, I thought, okay, well, that was one incredibly ultra-real, bizarre journey. But it was only over those weeks and months, as I learned more and more about my illness, went back and looked through all my medical records, talked it over with my physicians, went through all the neurologic exams and scans, that I started to realize there was something very wrong with our model of how the brain is related to consciousness. And in fact, my journey was very clearly one that shows us the brain does not create consciousness at all, which is exactly where the scientific world is headed on this very issue. So what is it that I remembered when I first came back to this world? Well, it all started in what I call the earthworm's eye view, a very primitive, coarse, unresponsive realm. Dark and murky. It was like being in dirty jello. And a strong sense of roots or blood vessels all around me. I can still kind of feel what they felt like, even though I had no body image at any point at all during this journey. I was just a point of awareness. Now, in this earthworm's eye view, I'm sure I had no kind of memory moment to moment. Memory is generally thought of as a function that's very demanding. And if you've got a really sick brain, your memory is not going to be working. But the interesting thing about my experience, and one of the kind of hallmarks of my NDE that makes it different from others, because many of the features of my NDE were very clear-cut examples that coincided with other NDEs reported by the tens of thousands out there in this world. But there was one very atypical feature, and that is the amnesia, the fact that I started with an empty slate. I had no words. I had no human concepts. I had no memories whatsoever of ever having existed in this universe. None of my religious beliefs, none of that scientific knowledge, every bit of it was gone. Now, in the weeks and months after coming back to this world, as a neurosurgeon, I thought, well, I guess that makes sense that I would be amnesic, because, in fact, my neocortex had been so ravaged by this illness. And our conventional science very vaguely believes that memories are stored in the neocortex, even though they are not, as we'll point out during some of the talks this week. And so in that earthworm eye view, it sounds very foreboding. And people would often ask me early on when I talked about my experiences, they would say, well, was that hell or purgatory? What was that earthworm eye view? Well, I think if I had just gone there and come back to this world, I would have had a hellish NDE. But in fact, it was suffocating and kind of confining. But given that I didn't remember anything else was possible, I simply accepted it as existence. And so that was something that I could live with. Now, the good news is I was not stuck there forever. There came to my rescue a clear white light with fine gold and silver tendrils off of it, and it was spinning very slowly. And it came towards me in that murky earthworm eye view, that subterranean dirty jello realm. But this clarity of this light was just perfect and beautiful. And the best thing about it was there had been a sound in that earthworm eye view. It was a smashing, pounding, monotonous, like someone smashing on an anvil. But when this pure white light came towards me, it came with a perfect musical melody. And the notes of that melody proved very crucial to me as this journey went on. Because what would happen is as I ascended to higher and higher levels, and I'll describe them in a minute, even all the way to the core, to the pure oneness, I would then tumble back down to that earthworm eye view, that very simplistic, coarse, unresponsive realm. But by remembering the musical notes, that's how I could work my way back up, because the musical notes would conjure up that pure white light. It would come back to me and open up yet again like a portal up into these higher realms. Now, this is a lot of the work that I do now, and what Karen Newell and I are here this week to discuss is sound in meditation and the use of differential frequency sounds. And I'll be talking a lot more about that tomorrow. We don't have time to go into it tonight. But the important point is that sound is the vehicle that our soul uses to traverse to higher and higher realms. Of course, humans have used sound, whether it be in the form of conch shells or Tibetan singing bowls or musical instruments or the acoustics of ancient sacred caves or caverns or cathedrals, what have you. Hymns, chants, anthems, that's what we've used to help us to get to those higher levels, to help us leave behind the little measly trickle of consciousness that is the illusion of this four-dimensional space-time that we live in down here. But there is a far grander consciousness that we all witness when we leave these physical bodies, when we die, when we leave that body behind. The body is like a costume in this act of the play. So when this act of the play is over, I discard the costume, reunite with my higher soul, go through that life review in the presence of those beautiful soulmates in the soul group, and then we plan our next incarnation and come back. And so that kind of higher consciousness is something that we can see when we're broken free from the shackles of the physical brain. We are conscious in spite of our brain. And that is the emerging paradigm that's coming to the scientific world as we get deeper and deeper into understanding these kind of journeys. Now, in that first passage up through that clear light, I entered what I call the Gateway Valley. And it's a gateway because it was only a passageway to higher and higher levels. And yet, it was very much a realm that was fitting to reunite with higher souls and soulmates, soul groups, to go through life reviews, all of the stage work, the things that are comfortable to us. The reason near-death experiences often reflect one's personal beliefs and maybe their religious views. But believe me that near-death experiences, by and large, will reshape your views on this. We use our words and our language to express things, but remember that our earthly language was developed more or less to describe trips to Disney World, not to describe trips to realms where you are face-to-face and fully absorbing full-blown, infinite, universal consciousness. That's why they're so difficult to put into words. Now, in this beautiful Gateway Valley, it had many Earth-like features. And I remember it being very ultra-real, everything about it. And part of that ultra-reality is the fact that you're not seeing with the eyes. You're not hearing with the ears. And you don't have the normal filtering mechanisms of the neocortex that are there to dumb everything down and reduce it down to this tiny little trickle that we're used to in these lives. In that realm, you get full-blown exposure to every bit of it. There are times when you become, the boundaries of self completely dissolve. You become other beings, entire groups of beings. In fact, at times I became the whole higher dimensional multiverse throughout all of infinity and eternity. That's a very, very difficult thing to put into any kind of words for any human to understand, but I hope you get it, that by that point one has left anything resembling ego and the false boundaries of self far, far behind. Now, in this beautiful valley, it was lush, fertile, beyond description. Blossoms, buds, flowers, all opening up very richly, everything dynamic, creative, fertile beyond description, and just this absolutely amazing sense as you become all of that. Colors beyond the rainbow. Now, I was moving up through this because I was a speck of awareness on a butterfly wing, a beautiful butterfly, and it was one of millions of butterflies that were looping and swirling in these vast spiraling formations of light and color and life and just bliss, and going down into that lush greenery with all of I'm sorry for using the word beautiful again, but just absolutely indescribable bliss of that realm. And all of the below me were all of these beings, thousands, and they were dressed in kind of peasant garb. And when I wrote all that up weeks later and trying to make sense of this, trying to record my journey, I said that these were souls between lives. They were like villagers. In fact, at one point I said they were dressed in simple peasant garb, but it was very simple clothing and yet bright, colorful. Lots of joy and merriment. Everyone was dancing. Incredible music, dancing, children playing, and dogs jumping. Just an incredible world. Festivities. All this excitement and bliss and sharing of joy going on below me was being fueled because up above, golden orbs swooping against a blue-black velvety sky with these towering, billowing clouds of pure color lighting the entire scene. And on this butterfly wing, the best part about it is I wasn't alone. There was a beautiful girl. Doesn't get any better than that. And I'll never forget how she looked at me. Sparkling blue eyes, wide smile, high forehead, high cheekbones, dressed in that simple kind of peasant garb. She never said a word, but she looked at me with a smile of love, pure, unconditional love that just blew right through me. And I remember the message that came to me from her telepathically, because obviously no words, and when these thoughts come through, it's complete and absolute. It's not the linear kind of limitations of linguistics that we're normally find here on earth in our communications. But her thoughts came straight into my awareness, and they're a fundamental part of the message in the book Proof of Heaven, because they're really messages for all souls. And it went something like this when I wrote it all up a few weeks later. Her thoughts came into me. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You will be taken care of. You have nothing to fear. And I came to realize through this entire journey, of course, that that old saying from Winston Churchill, there's nothing to fear but fear itself, rings very, very deeply true at all levels in this kind of spiritual journey. And there is nothing to fear, especially as we come to know our divine connection with each other through consciousness and the connection with the divine, and that this is all a spiritual world, a spiritual universe, and we will be taken care of. Now, there was another part of that message that I wish I had expanded a little more where it appears in the book Proof of Heaven, because bundled with that you will be taken care of, you have nothing to fear, was you can do no wrong. Now, it turns out that I already knew, I was beginning to glimpse at this point in the journey where that was going. And it has to do with the fact that this is soul school. We're here in this realm to learn and teach those lessons of ascendance. All of sentient beings throughout the universe are participating in this ascendance of consciousness. And the lesson that is foremost for humanity to learn at this point is that lesson of love. It's not as if we've really gotten it, even though the message was very plainly pointed out to us thousands of years ago by the beautiful prophets who brought us our kind of religious views, all the modern religions, everything about that love and compassion and forgiveness that we are here to learn today. Now, by do no wrong, what she was really telling me is that we have a gift of free will. Now, that conventional science that I mentioned to you at the beginning of this talk very proudly will tell you, our conventional neuroscience says no human being has free will. In fact, they would try and convince you that consciousness is an illusion, an epiphenomenon of the workings of the subatomic particles, atoms, molecules, and cells of the brain. But they've got it completely backwards. And so, in fact, realizing that this is soul school, that we're here to learn those lessons, that God gives us that gift of free will to make these choices. And it's how we face the hardships and difficulties in life. They are gifts. But if we can face them and make choices out of love, compassion, forgiveness, acceptance, and mercy, that's what we are here to learn now. That's the path of ascendance. But we can choose to do otherwise. That gift of free will allows us to be selfish, to be greedy, to be egocentric, to harm others, other beings. This is not just about humans at all. Animals have very, very rich souls. It's that consciousness is something we all share. But we can choose to do wrong, but when we do that, hand out that evil and suffering to others, it simply means that our life review when we leave this world is going to be more challenging. Because in the life review, we become those other beings. In the life review, which is not some New Age concept, the life review goes back at least as far back as Plato, when he recounted the story of the Armenian soldier killed in battle 2,400 years ago, laid on a funeral pyre, who then came back to earth, came back to life. And had a story to tell. And two of the most prominent features is that you go through a life review, you know, that's saying your life flashes before your eyes. Well, yes. And not just that, but the Armenian soldier, realized that the only thing that matters is the love that we've managed to serve as a conduit for ourselves and for our fellow beings while we live in these earthly incarnations. So do nothing wrong really means, you know, prepare for that life review. Karen often reminds me to do a daily review, so my life review will be a lot easier. Because in that life review, you do become the souls that you afflicted not only with your actions, but with your thoughts. And so it really is about a purification that we're going through here and learning these lessons. Now, on that butterfly wing with this beautiful girl, there came a perfect summer breeze, a warm and balmy breeze that blew through, and everything shifted. And when I look back on it, in my early writings, I called that breeze the breath of God, divine wind. It was my first awareness, if you recall, that I was amnesic for everything. I had an empty slate. That was my first awareness of the divine in this realm, of the infinite power of that loving source and the power of that unconditional love. And after that breeze went through, what I was then aware of, the angelic choirs above, those swooping orbs of light that had been emanating these incredible chants and anthems and hymns blowing through me. And they served as yet another portal, once again, sound, vibration, frequency, allowing our souls to transcend to higher and higher realms. I remember seeing all of space and time collapsing down, our four-dimensional space-time all down, and then that deeper spiritual universe, that Gateway Valley, where causality is very different. That's a much more fundamental arrangement of causality and of ascendance of soul groups going towards that oneness with the divine that completely trumps earth time. Time here is very much an illusion. Einstein knew that. He said past, present, and future are cleverly wrought illusions. And in fact, it's only by getting into the deepest aspects of trying to blend together quantum mechanics and relativity that we will completely reassess our views of time and time flow and causality. But in those higher levels, there's a whole different ordering because this is a spiritual universe. That's the ordering of causality, is the journey of these souls and soul groups and the whole transcendence of consciousness that Teilhard de Chardin spoke of. And that's what this process is about. But as I saw all of that collapsing down, it all came down to this incredibly complex oversphere, multiverse, all of eternity, infinity. And that was there like a beach ball as part of the demonstrations in the core realm. Now the core, infinite, inky blackness, dazzling darkness, paradox, filled to overflowing, not only with light, but simultaneously with darkness, also with love, with the overwhelming power of unconditional love, of that divine source for all that is. And feeling that, witnessing that in any sense is what brings so many near-death experiences back to this world, realizing there's absolutely nothing whatsoever to fear about death. Now, in that realm, there was also a brilliant orb of light, brighter than 1,000,000 stars, that I remember kind of seeing that notion of the three of us. That brilliant orb was like a translator or an interpreter to help me to understand the teachings of that infinite divine oneness. Now, in that core realm, this really is not something that one can put into any kind of earthly language to make sense. I sometimes compare it to being on the edge of a black hole, where there is, on the one side, that infinite oneness without any kind of separation of anything. And in that core, that absolute core, we are one with the divine. There is no separation. Now, in our Western spiritual traditions, there is difficulty with professing any oneness with God, to identify with God. Luckily, some of the Eastern spiritual traditions are much better about that. But in that core realm, there's absolutely no separation. But right at that boundary, just like the event horizon of a black hole, you start to see how all of that kind of apparent separation that works its way to the outermost layers, which is where we are in this four-dimensional space-time, in this illusory here and now. But it's seeing that whole process of the back and forth, the holographic principle, the infinite oneness that also is separated out into the infinite number of parts. And yet the whole thing is self-referential. And only by knowing the oneness can we really come to understand this. This is one of the reasons why the approach of our modern science, reductive materialism, is such an absolute dead end. They assume that by tearing everything down to the fundamental parts and then understanding those parts, you can figure it all out. Whereas in fact, the top-down approach makes far more sense to me. That's why meditation is so important, to come to see all of the relationships as opposed to throwing it all out. Now, in that core realm, I was told, you're not here to stay. Of course, not by words, but the conceptual flow. But we will teach you many things. And it turns out that that's where so many of those lessons applied. And yet, as I said earlier, I would then tumble back down spontaneously into that earthworm eye view. But again, by remembering the musical notes of the melody, going over them in my mind, even in that very primitive, coarse, subterranean realm, there would come that beautiful, clear white light, spinning slowly and ushering me back up again into that beautiful gateway valley on the butterfly wing, always welcomed in by that beautiful girl, sparkling blue eyes, the same message. You are loved and cherished deeply forever. You will be taken care of. You have nothing to fear. And then ascending back up through those angelic choirs to those highest levels and the core realm and the oneness and the lessons. Back again and again, but they weren't kidding when they said you're not here to stay. I had actually come to believe that when they said you'll be going back was to the earthworm eye view. So I thought, well, this isn't that big a problem because by remembering the notes of the melody, I'm ever able to get back up out of there. But there came a time when that no longer worked. I conjured up the notes of the melody, and there was no spinning white light. To say I was sad at that point would be an understatement. If you can imagine monsoon rains throughout all of eternity, you might be able to glimpse some of the despair. But I will stress that by that time I knew I could trust. I'd been promised I would be taken care of, that I had nothing to fear, and I trusted that completely, as I always will. Now it turns out at that point that I was then back in kind of murky, misty, roiling, incredible boiling clouds and mists and kind of confusion and darkness and lights here and there. And I remember seeing out of those kind of mists below me thousands of beings arcing off into the distance, some with candles, some with hoods, many with their heads bowed and murmuring. And this murmuring energy was surprising to me because in that kind of dark realm, the murmuring energy brought back that same power of unconditional love that I had felt in the gateway realm and in the core. And when I wrote it all up weeks later, those beings around me by the thousands, I said that was the energy of prayer. I could feel the prayer for others coming to me, helping to bring me back. But I didn't know back to what. And then there were 6 faces that appeared. And they would come to me kind of boiling out of the mist. And I can remember them today as clearly as if it happened this morning. But at the time when I saw them, I had no idea who they were. It turns out that 5 of them were faces of people who were there in the ICU room the last 24 hours I was in coma. So in fact, that helped me very much later on to kind of pinpoint all this and realize that the vast majority of the coma journey that seemed to go on for months or years, it was a very extraordinary odyssey. But it must have happened between days 1 and 5 of Earth time, of my coma, and not at the end when I was coming out. That's a very important point because it had to do with trying to figure out how all this happened. Now, one of those faces was of someone who was not there. She was never physically within 120 miles of me. This was a family friend who had channeled up to me from Chapel Hill, North Carolina. She had been contacted, told I was in deep coma. She had done a lot of channeling work with coma patients before. And she came to me, and I remember her as clearly as the others who were there physically present in the ICU room the last 24 hours of coma. But it was really the sixth face that appeared to me that was the most shocking. There were many points in this journey where I thought this can all continue or it can cease. It does not matter. And that was part of my fearlessness, was the amnesia allowed me to be fearless. But you don't need that. All you need to remember is that each and every one of us is a divine, eternal, spiritual being, infinitely connected eternally to the divine and to each other. And that other face changed all of that. It was the face of a 10-year-old boy. It was my son Bond. Turns out that was that Sunday morning when they'd held the family meeting. And Bond, they had protected from most of the bad news through most of that week. And Bond had hung around outside the room when they held the family conference and recommended stopping the antibiotics and letting nature take its course, letting me go. And he knew that was bad news. So he came running down the hallway into ICU room 10. And there I was on my ventilator, as I had been for 7 days. He pulled open my eyelids. "Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay. Daddy, you're going to be okay." As if somehow that would make it so. Now, I promise you, I did not see him with my eyes. I didn't hear him with my ears. I was very far gone in these deep spiritual realms, and this was when all that murk and boiling cloud was all around me, and I saw those six faces, and he was the sixth face. And all of a sudden I knew it did matter, that I had to go back, whatever back was back to. And it was my love for him, even though I had no notion of his being my son. But there was that connection, even though I didn't understand the words. But that deep connection, and I knew I had to come back for Bond, to be there for him somehow, whatever it meant. And it's the most difficult thing I've ever done in my entire existence. It was like climbing out of a deep, dark hole, and every grab trying to climb out, everything would just collapse in on me. It was impossible to come back, but it was impossible not to come back. I had to do it. It was that deep bond of love. And so that's when I started coming back to this world. And as I said, when I first came back, I had no idea who even my family members and all were, but all that did come back. But then the mystery deepened over the next few weeks and months as I was bound and determined to understand this. The more I went to my medical records, talked it over with my doctors, and came to realize that this was impossible. It could not have happened. That ultra reality was the absolute opposite of what anyone would expect if you think the brain creates consciousness. And so, in fact, it was that linkage with Bond and that beautiful love that brought me back to this world. And there's another part of that story that I'll be sharing a little more tomorrow that has to do with the great revelation I had about 4 months after coming out of coma, when I was deeply into the mystery of it all, coming to realize the similarity of my journey to so many others and what it tells us about the true nature of this universe and about the true nature of our being and what we are here for. But I'll have to save that little part of the story for tomorrow. And for now, what I'd like to do is thank you and close just by reminding you of that beautiful message from my companion on the butterfly wing, because it's a message for each and every one of you as spiritual journeyers. You are deeply loved and cherished forever. You have nothing to fear. God bless you all. Thank you. Thank you.